Class is now in session. I'm Professor Hockey, and today we're discussing Game 34 of the regular season for the San Jose Sharks as they took on the Winnipeg Jets and lost by a score of 4-3. In the first matchup this season between these two teams that happened back in Game 5 of the regular season, the Sharks got absolutely run over, an 8-3 loss that they were never even remotely competitive in. To this day, it probably still remains their worst performance of the entire season, so they were looking for a little bit of revenge and redemption here tonight, and I would say that they sort of ended up getting that. Obviously, they still come out on the losing side of things, but their performance here tonight was significantly better than in that first game. They actually managed to go toe-to-toe with this Winnipeg Jets team that, mind you, finds themselves right at the top of the NHL standings, the number one team in the entire league in terms of points. And this wasn't a situation where the Jets came out slow and were playing terrible hockey, and that's why the Sharks were able to take advantage. The Jets actually looked pretty good. They managed to string together some solid shifts for themselves, but the Sharks, so did they, and that allowed them to actually end up in a pretty tight and competitive game against a very, very good team. Would I go so far as to say that the Sharks were the better team here tonight? Probably not. Even though they would have the advantage on the shot clock, many of these shots were from pretty far out, low danger type of opportunities that, especially going against one of the best goaltenders, if not the best goaltender in the league, Connor Hellebuyck, pretty much had a 0% chance of actually going in. It is at the very least indicative of the fact that the Sharks were playing a decent amount of time in the offensive zone, which consequently means that the Jets aren't getting those offensive chances. I would say that maybe Georgiev did have a slightly more difficult game between the pipes than Hellebuyck did, but not by that significant a margin, and the Sharks can be somewhat satisfied, I guess, at least normally they would be, with the type of performance they had. The reason I say that they're not going to be all that happy still, though, is with how this game actually ended, because it is once more a situation where the Sharks, they get in their own way. They shoot themselves in their own foot, almost seeming as though the Sharks are attempting to lose these games, like the organization is trying to get the best possible draft pick at the end of this season. It seems to be the only explanation for why the Sharks constantly are dropping games in regulation in just like the final moments of the third period. It just doesn't really make much sense at all. We start off in the first period. The Sharks, the first 10 or so minutes of it, are actually looking rather good, keeping control for themselves, not getting a ton of chances, but they're not giving the Jets much to work with either. However, then it is a mistake in the neutral zone that allows the Jets to find themselves on a 2-on-1, and Kyle Connor makes it 1-0, and that is the score at the end of the first period. In the second, which ends up being the Sharks' best period of the game, Tyler Toffoli ties it up against his former team, his 13th of the season. That is a 2-1 game. Then on the Jets' very lethal power play, they are first place in the NHL in terms of power play percentage, and we saw why here. The speed and the mobility of this Jets power play was too much for the Sharks to handle, and it makes it 2-1 for the Jets. Then on the Sharks' own power play, it is Celebrini who makes it 2-2, and that is the score at the end of the second period. And then we all experience a sense of deja vu here in the third period, as this one plays out the identical fashion as the previous game, almost identical, against the Utah Hockey Club. The Sharks, in a tie game, have a lead in the early third period thanks to a goal this time from Fabian Zetterlund, but then they give up the game-tying goal to Kyle Connor, and then in the last minute or so of the third period, it is Adam Lowry who gets the go-ahead goal that eventually ends up being the game winner, as the Sharks just simply do not have enough time to catch up, just as Clayton Keller did on the power play that time in the last game against Utah. And so it is the Sharks who shoot themselves in the foot. As we look at this Adam Lowry play, it is, tell me if you've heard this one before, Mario Ferraro, who gives this puck away along the boards, allows the Jets to keep it in, and eventually end up with this tip in goal. But it's not even so much to single out Ferraro, because while he ultimately makes a mistake that leads to this goal, he's not the only defenseman doing so. A minute prior to that, it was Cody Ceci, and a minute prior to that, it was Timothy Liljegren. It is these Sharks players who are making too many lackadaisical and purposeless passes in so many tight moments of these games. It's one thing if you're doing this a couple of minutes into the first period. Maybe you don't have your legs. Maybe you're not fully engaged into the game yet. But in a 3-3 tie with like 2-3 minutes left on the clock, to be making these types of just lazy plays, that's just something that cannot be happening. And yet 34 games into the season, it continues to do so, just as it did in game 1 of the season. And this isn't even a situation where I'm criticizing Ryan Warsofsky. It's not a systems problem necessarily, unless maybe you could say, well, the forwards aren't supporting them enough. But I've seen way too many unforced errors from the defense to think that that is the primary issue. It's just these players are not taking the proper amount of time to actually think up a better play. And it's one thing to say, well, the defense is just not very good for the Sharks, and that is absolutely the case. But there are times in which any player should be able to make the simpler play, and yet for whatever reason, they're still just wildly throwing pucks out. There was a moment in the early part of the second period, very, very early on, like first shift, I would say, Jan Rutta gets this puck behind the goal line. He has very little incoming pressure. There's no actual forechecker on him, and instead of picking this puck up, skating with it a little bit, moving up the middle of the ice and starting a breakout for the Sharks, he just slaps it out of the zone. I don't know if there's no communication or what, but this is just such a wrong play that ends up getting picked off by the Jets and leads to some zone time for themselves. I just don't know what is going through the mind of Jan Rutta and through many of these Sharks defensemen who continue to have these unforced errors. Moving on to the players to talk about, however, we have the Sharks top line. At least, while it might not seem like the top line on paper, at the very least the organization themselves have indicated to be the number one line. It is Granlund and Zetterlund being joined by Barclay Goodrow. Barclay Goodrow somehow manages to always find himself in a scoring line position throughout this entire season. I'm pretty sure that he has literally never found himself on the fourth line for this entire year thus far. He's always been in that top 9 for the San Jose Sharks. And it's crazy because here tonight, he didn't play a bad game. It's not as though he was just so out of place and so terrible that makes you think, oh, this guy needs to be healthy scratched. He's just not doing much. He just doesn't have the offensive talent. He only just picked up his first assist of the entire season last game, giving him a resounding 3 points on the year. Clearly the least effective offensive player who's still getting decent deployment and decent ice time on this entire team. If you take a look at his actual line mates consistently throughout this season prior to this game, he has spent 50% of his even strength ice time playing with one, if not both, Macklin Celebrini and Will Smith. These are two skilled, talented young players that Goodrow is being attached to through many, many games, and yet he still has 3 points on the season. That just goes to show how little value he's actually bringing from an offensive perspective. And yet, if he was played in a fourth line role, he got 7 minutes of even strength ice time, maybe like 2-3 minutes of shorthanded ice time per night, I would probably be pretty satisfied. And yet, he is always in the Sharks' top 9. You could say, well, maybe Klim Kostin being injured, is that why it opens up a spot for him? But I'd rather see Cunnin here. I'd rather even see Dellandrea, who was actually a healthy scratch here tonight, in this position. Anyone but Barclay Goodrow, who has already proven time and time again to not be very good in this actual spot. And the only possible explanation that he can possibly even think of is that when the Sharks originally acquired him this past offseason off of waivers, this was a weird move from Mike Grier from the get-go, because this was a terrible contract to pick up for free from the New York Rangers. But the only reason I can think of is that Goodrow had a no-trade clause at the point in which he was waived, and the Sharks were on that list. He did not want to come to San Jose. I don't know why Grier brought him in the first place, but maybe as a way to kind of like keep him happy and placate him, they said, oh, we're not going to just play you fourth line minutes, we're going to make sure you're actually in a scoring position night in and night out, because that is exactly the approach they have taken with Goodrow thus far this season. And that's why he ends up on a top line with the Sharks' leading point scorer and also Fabian Zetterlund, who's not too bad himself. And as expected, he doesn't really provide much offense, as I said. When it comes to the two other players here, it does need to be noted that this first line as a whole was matched up pretty aggressively against the Jets' first line of Connor and Scheifele and Velarde, and the Jets' first line clearly got the better of that matchup more often than not. But this group of players did still have their opportunities. Mikael Granlund, I liked the energy and the effort that he did bring here tonight. He was skating very hard. We saw some very nice shifts for himself of breaking through the defense and just playing with a ton of speed. The thing is, and what has been a major problem for Granlund it feels as though these last few weeks more or less, it feels as though he's lacking a little bit of that finesse that he had back at the beginning of the season. It feels as though back at the beginning of the year, he could always find those openings. He could always get that assist here or there, that goal here or there. But right now, he's struggling in that particular area. Certainly, having Barclay Goodrow with him did not help the cause, but it just felt as though he was a little bit off throughout much of this game, which has been a bit of a theme for him through a last few weeks of the season thus far. Then when it comes to his teammate Fabian Zetterlund, also on his line, I actually thought Zetterlund played a pretty good game as well. Again, hemmed into their own zone pretty significantly, so it was not a great game for any of these players. But when they had their moments, when they had their looks, we saw Zetterlund actually capitalize on one of them with that goal, and he all in all played an okay enough game. When it comes to the Sharks' second line, we have Celebrini, Kovalenko, and Toffoli. We'll start off with Macklin Celebrini, as I am kind of running out of things to be said about him. He was once again perhaps the Sharks' best forward of the night, perhaps the Sharks' best player in general of the night. He picks up a goal, a nice look-off. I don't know if this was fully intentional, but it looked quite cool on the backhand play to completely surprise the Winnipeg Jets and Connor Hellebuck in nets to get that goal for himself. He also picks up the secondary assist on the Toffoli goal. That makes him a point-per-game player on the season, 22 points in 22 games with his 11 goals. He draws 2 penalties, which is likely something that we're going to see a lot of throughout his entire career. The best of the best players in the NHL, like the McDavids and the likes, are always able to draw these penalties because of the fact that they're just so much better than their opposing players that they're forced to take these holds, these slashes, these high sticks, things of that nature to attempt to slow them down. And we saw that here tonight with those 2 drawn penalties. But, I mean, how much more real positives can I lay onto such a player here? He's just that amazing for the Sharks. When it comes to his 2 line mates, we have Nikolai Kovalenko, who continues to be proving himself as an incredibly good pickup for Mike Grier in that Blackwood trade. He picks up a primary assist on this Toffoli goal, but that's not even like the big moment, even though that is a nice assist. It is actually his breakout pass a few seconds prior from his own zone to Celebrini through a couple of Jets players to open up this opportunity for themselves to get this rush chance. That is what really stands out for Kovalenko. If there are a couple of things to mention to potentially improve, first, I'd like to see him actually be more of a shooting option. We saw a rush chance early in the first period for this line. Celebrini finds Kovalenko. He's in a great shooting position, but instead of doing so, he tries to pass it to Tyler Toffoli. And it'd be one thing if this was like a pass to a empty net, that Toffoli would have an easy tap-in goal, but it actually really wasn't that much so. And so I would have much rather have seen Kovalenko actually take that shot and look for the possible goal from in close. On top of that, we have seen the playmaking ability from him. He has looked really, really good in those particular areas. I would like to see him maybe try and pick and choose the moments to go for it. There were a couple of passes this game in which he was actually handcuffing his teammates instead of actually setting themselves up well. I remember an opportunity moving up the ice in which he gives a pass to Celebrini in a really, really tough spot that causes him to essentially lose the puck immediately right after. If Kovalenko had held onto it, probably would have gotten a better opportunity. So that's going to be something that comes with a little bit more time, but the fact that he's already developing chemistry with the Sharks' best player on the ice, Celebrini, to actually make up a strong duo and a strong trio if we also include Tyler Toffoli in it, is a very nice sign. He has 5 assists in the 3 games since he's been here, or 5 in the 4 games since he's been here, something like that. And he's been looking really, really good. And when it comes to the other line mate here, Tyler Toffoli, who has also been playing some very strong hockey, probably his best hockey as a San Jose Shark over these last couple of weeks. It certainly helps when you're paired with Macklin Celebrini and he can just kind of set you up for many of these opportunities. But Toffoli himself has not been much of a slouch. He's been playing better defensive hockey compared to the beginning of the season. He's been playing more patient hockey as well, and the patience is actually paying off compared to earlier on where he was trying to slow down the game and essentially he was just slowing it down for the Sharks themselves. He's playing with more pace. He's actually being more aggressive and winning battles in the neutral zone. So I've really liked how Toffoli has, I wouldn't say turned his season around because he was never really terrible, but he definitely wasn't living up to those expectations, and now he definitely is. When it comes to the Sharks' third line, we have a trio of Smith and Wenberg, and they are joined by William Eklund, and this was definitely a very interesting view to see. I believe this is the first time we've actually seen that pairing of Smith and Eklund together, and I think it actually worked out very, very well, at least from a Will Smith perspective. He doesn't show up on the scoreboard here tonight. He didn't pick up a goal or a point or anything like that, and yet I actually thought he was one of the best players on the ice for the Sharks. He had some great puck touches, some really nice moves, some solid passes. He was skating pretty hard. He was getting engaged in the game. He was still doing the classic Will Smith of maybe avoiding a little bit of physical contact, but we saw him actually get a couple of hits in, get into a couple of battles as well, which is an improvement over what we usually see from Will Smith. And so I actually thought this was one of his most effective games of the season, even if the points didn't actually follow, and hopefully he can carry that forward. And it also seems as though Warsofsky recognized this, considering not only did he get some decent ice time here tonight of about 15 minutes, but he actually got in the 6-on-5 situation as well. He was someone who the Sharks looked towards to help equalize this game, and while the Sharks didn't actually end up doing that because they just didn't really have enough time, it is still a nice indication of how well Smith looked tonight. When it comes to his line mate, William Eklund, as I said, I think there was some solid chemistry here beginning to develop. There were a couple of moments where they seemed a little bit off in the sense that they weren't fully on the same page, but you could definitely see that there were possible seeds that could potentially sprout into a very strong duo for the San Jose Sharks. There were moments in which they did find those connections, and if they are left together on the same line, it could end up leading to something really good. The thing is, however, is that I don't know how if Warsofsky's going to want to keep Goodrow with Granlund and Zetterlund, so it is certainly very possible going into next game that Goodrow is swapped back down to this third line with Smith and Wenberg, and then Eklund ends up joining his two other Lunds on the top line. I could see that happening, but I certainly wouldn't be opposed and maybe even in favor if we leave Eklund and Smith together here. When it comes to Alex Wenberg, I think he's a pretty good defensive complement on this line, very responsible in his own end, the ability to really slow things down in the defensive zone, which allows Smith and Eklund to actually be more aggressive in terms of breaking out and playing in the neutral zone, so that is a good thing. From an offensive perspective, I don't know if he's the best complement here. While Wenberg does have a good shot, he actually has to be willing to use it, and we don't always see him actually have that willingness, and I think being able to have someone with a slightly better shot in the situation to actually be able to pick up on these passes from both Smith and Eklund would be a little bit better, but at the same time, the Sharks don't really have that extra player to be able to fit into that spot. So I don't hate the fact that Wenberg is here. I still think it looks rather solid, and as a whole, this line was pretty good. When it comes to the Sharks' fourth line, we have Grundstrom, Sturm, and Cunnin. It's interesting when it takes a look at this fourth line because with the increased added depth that the Sharks have had with the Kovalenko acquisition in that Blackwood trade, once Kostin does return from IR, and I imagine he will be an insert into the Sharks' top 12, more and more of these kind of fringe fourth liners are going to be having to get bumped out, and you're really fighting for your life at this point. And Grundstrom in particular is someone who has the spotlight on him. At the beginning of the season, he was not very good. Then he had like a 2-week stretch where he was actually quite solid for San Jose, but then over the last month, he's been pretty invisible for them and even getting healthy scratched a few times. So this was maybe a last-ditch effort to try and prove his worth, again, depending on how long Kostin is actually going to be out of the lineup for. And I thought Grundstrom did have an increased level of effort here tonight. He was engaged, he was throwing his body around, he was trying to get involved in the play, and I thought he did an okay job of that. It still remains in a situation where Grundstrom does not have a goal this season, and that obviously stands out as like a sore thumb here almost halfway through the year, but I thought he was all right here tonight. Cunnin, I didn't really notice all that much, but I did think Sturm had a pretty good game. And then when it comes to the Sharks' defensive unit, as I said earlier on in this one, a lot of unforced errors, a lot of mistakes that just should not be continuing to happen, and yet they do. We start off with Jake Wallman here. I thought Wallman was mostly good here tonight. I thought he had some really good plays. Obviously, the pass originally leading to this Fabian Zetterlund goal on that 3-on-1 type of spot was a good one that got the Sharks the 3-2 lead early in the third period. Then, of course, there was the mistake on the Kyle Connor first goal that leads to this 2-on-1 situation that gives the Jets the 1-0 lead, so it certainly wasn't a perfect game, but I thought he was all right. When it comes to his defensive partner, Cody Ceci, he as well, I thought was like mostly pretty decent, but then, as I already mentioned earlier on, that bad giveaway in the last couple of minutes in the third period is kind of like that "what have you done for me lately" type of moment, and so the last thing you really remember of Cody Ceci is a bad play, and so that obviously hangs over the head of his performance here tonight. When it comes to the Sharks' second defensive pairing, we have Mario Ferraro, who continues to just be such a frustrating player. It feels as though like 75% of the time, obviously I'm just kind of pulling a number out of here, but 75% of the time Ferraro is actually like a pretty good defenseman. He's making some decent plays. He's covering his man rather well. He actually has some skill at times. We've seen him below the goal line make passes off the boards to himself to back off pressure. He has some decent skating that can also do the very same thing. And yet 25% of the time, Ferraro is making these hair-pulling, extremely aggravating, massive mistakes. It'd be one thing if these were just small errors, but these are like egregious mistakes that frequently end up in the back of the Sharks' net that just makes him an unreliable player. He's kind of like the Klim Kostin of defense, but because he blocks and hits so many times, Warsofsky still goes to him for these really, really tough situations. And so that's how we end up in a spot in which, with a minute and a half left on the clock, Ferraro gives the puck away and allows allows the Jets to eventually end up getting this goal, not to mention that Lowry is Ferraro's man in front of the net, and he's unable to tie up this stick to prevent this tip-in goal for them that gave them that game winner so late in the game. So Ferraro continues to just be this frustrating defenseman on the ice for the Sharks. Liljegren, very similar to Cody Ceci, where I thought mostly he looked all right. He had some really strong defensive moves in this game. He saved a goal, or perhaps even a couple of goals for the Sharks early on in this one. However, it is also a what have you done for me lately type of moment, and right as that Sharks power play late in the third period did expire, we see Liljegren make a huge mistake that leads to a great Jets chance, and that kind of hangs over the rest of the game. When it comes to the Sharks' third defensive pairing, we'll start off with Mukhamadullin, who has kind of been on a little bit of a downward trend, I would say. When he originally, I guess it's kind of up and down more so, because when he made his debut a couple of games ago, he was very steady, very simple, kind of just like a 5-on-10 type of performance, not much to get upset about, but not much to be very excited about. And then last game, we saw that confidence and that willingness to be aggressive actually come into his game, and he ended up being more positive than negatives, even if there were some bad moments. Here tonight, however, the negatives did outweigh the positives. There were a couple of moments in which he was just getting way too aggressive, and he got burned a couple of times because of that. There are also moments in the defensive zone where he's just getting kind of lost in terms of his actual coverage. It is difficult to make the transition from the AHL to the NHL, especially if the Sharks are playing a different system, and so you're kind of having to try and find your way into that. We already see that Sharks defensemen who have been here for 34 games on the season still struggle at times with keeping their positioning in the defensive zone, so I'm not really that upset that Mukhamadulin's struggling in that area. However, as we know, Warsofsky is quick on the trigger to switch things in the lineup, and so I would not be particularly surprised if Thrun, or perhaps even Vlasic, depending on how his health is progressing, is actually in the lineup for the next game. When it comes to his defensive partner, Jan Ruda, I already talked about that terrible mistake he made at the beginning of the second period that just made absolutely zero sense, and that was just kind of like the headline of a game that was mostly not very good for him. And then finally, we have the Sharks goaltender, Alexander Georgiev. Very far, I would say, from the actual blame here tonight. The first Connor goal, he had zero chance on. The Scheifele one was a very difficult save. The second Connor goal, you could argue maybe because there's not much traffic in front, but not only is this from pretty in tight, like the bottom of the face-off dot, but Connor is an elite scorer, like a 40, 50 potential goal scorer in the NHL. He's got a really, really good shot that is not an easy save for any goaltender, so I can't really blame Georgiev for that either. And then the Lowry one is tipped in as well. So he gives up 4. It's not great, but he was very, very far from the blame here tonight. But that will do it for this review. The Sharks will be back in action on Thursday, where they'll be taking on the Colorado Avalanche, so the team that they very just recently traded with when they gave away Mackenzie Blackwood and picked up Kovalenko and that second round pick, and Georgiev himself, who played here tonight. They will be facing off. Georgiev, it is unlikely I guess it is possible he gets the start. I would have normally thought Vanacek would be in, but we saw Vanacek actually takes a puck to the face, I believe, on the bench this game, and then he leaves and does not return, so I don't know fully the actual severity of this injury. Will he be healthy enough to play? Will the Sharks have to call up Askarov? Will Askarov play in that game, or will Georgiev get an opportunity for some revenge against his former team? But what we probably will see is Blackwood in nets for Colorado, and we shall see if he puts up as good of a performance against the Sharks as he did when he was with them. Class dismissed.